Winter, 1942. The Volga isn't water anymore, it's a scar. White, split, and humming with cold. On both banks, the air tastes like brick dust and burned oil. The city on its edge, Stalingrad, has forgotten what it means to be a city. It is cellars and smoke and rooms that remember furniture. It is holes in the ground pretending to be addresses. And yet, somehow, people still breathe here. NTHE, German Army, came as a geometry problem. Squares of infantry, arrows of armor, a neat solution to a messy continent. The Red Army met it with rubble and stubbornness. Streets narrowed into killing lanes. Factories became fortresses with machine hearts. The map stopped being useful. The only things that made sense now were distance, breath, and the second hand on a pocket watch. From the Urals came a man who understood those three things better than most. He had grown up watching wolves learn patience. He learned to read snow for sentences. His name was Vasily Zaitsev, and his rifle spoke quietly, like someone telling the truth. NHE arrived with a standard Mosin Nagant. No romance attached, no tricks, no scope at first. He was not tall, not particularly theatrical, the kind of man you'd ignore in line for bread. But war had a way of finding the ones who knew how to be still. On his first day at the front, he crawled through a collapsed roof to a chimney that had become a sightline. He waited until the cold turned the inside of his mouth to iron. A German officer lifted himself out of a tank hatch to gesture, impatient, confident. The gesture never landed. The officer folded like a card. The tank crouched as if surprised. NBY sunset. 4 more Germans were gone, men who had believed the day was theirs. By the end of the week, Zaitsev wasn't a man anymore. He was a rumor that moved with the wind. The rumor said, "Don't stand, don't breathe, don't be interesting." Stalingrad punished anything interesting. Buildings that once held laughter now held angles. A window wasn't a view, it was an opinion about risk. Streets were conversations in which only mortars got the last word. The ground heaved with metal bones. Somewhere under the snow were songs, and somewhere above it was the quiet work of deciding which silhouette deserved to end. Zaitsev looked through his iron sights and saw not uniforms, but habits. A sergeant who always lifted binoculars the same way. A runner who took the same shortcut. A man who liked to point with his whole arm. His notebook never left his pocket. It was the only book he read that winter. NTHE Germans weren't blind. They learned the shape of the danger. They learned to keep their heads low, to move like shy animals. Patrols swapped their swagger for caution. The snipers came in pairs. The pairs stopped coming. When the story of the Russian sniper reached German headquarters, it arrived without adjectives, which is how you know a story is real. A unit shook. A commander cursed. Someone wrote a name on a wall that never met paint again. And then a new story grew teeth. The Germans had sent a teacher to kill a student, an elite marksman, an instructor from Zossen, a man of metals and doctrine. His name, some said, was Major Koenig. Legends do not ask permission. They step into rooms as if they own them. The duel that followed was not a duel the way pictures show. There were no raised hats, no gentlemen, no countdown. There was rubble and glass ground into powder, and a wind that clawed through sleeves. There was also quiet, the kind that makes you understand why breath has temperature. 2 men, 1 city, and 100 small decisions that would decide which of them would walk away. Zaitsev had a spotter, a young soldier with a face that still belonged to another life. Together they became a single animal, 2 eyes, 1 trigger. They shifted positions between ruined walls, crawled past beams that had been rooms, and took the long way around because the short way around was a trick with a funeral attached. NFOR 3 days. Nothing. Or rather, almost nothing. A glint that might have been snow pretending to be a lens, a helmet that might have been someone's idea of bait, the slight, soft slump of snow that said a person had breathed here not long ago. They took turns blinking, They learned to sip water without moving the throat. Patience wasn't a virtue. It was a weapon. On the fourth morning, the wind changed stories. It blew ice in a straight line and made a far-off flag stiff enough to read nothing at all. Zaitsev lay with his cheek against the stalk until it felt like wood and bone belonged to a single tree. Across the courtyard, a smashed office floor, a collapsed staircase, maps once tacked to walls that didn't know their purpose anymore. Then, there, light off glass. It lasted the length of a blink. It shouldn't have been there. No glass remained in those windows, and none of the snow in that direction carried the right glitter. He kept his finger still and his breathing quieter, as if the air itself had orders. NTHE glint came again, careful this time, a stingy slice of sun. It wasn't a sloppy mistake. It was a message. Someone was telling him, "I know you're looking." NHE didn't shoot. He slid backward, slow as a minute, and moved around the perimeter of ruin until the angle changed. He and the spotter traded looks, the kind men have when they trust each other more than they trust their next heartbeat. The new position showed nothing except a pile of rubble where there had once been a pillar. No rifle, no man. Just the suggestion of a small, deliberate hole at the base of the debris, a mouse hole for someone who wanted to chew through nerves. In bait, then, a false scope placed to make the other hunter show teeth. Zaitsev didn't. He let the hole be a hole. He let the cold talk. The cold said, "Wait until the sun moves the thought inside that other man's head." And time became the only thing happening. The city groaned. A building fell farther into itself somewhere to the east. And a column of smoke told the sky a story the sky already knew. Zaitsev measured each minute with the small ache in the muscles between his shoulder and neck. He waited until patience felt like a fever he could ride. Midday, then afternoon. The spotter pressed 2 fingers into the dirt and left a mark that meant, "I'm here." A rat considered risking fame and scurried back under a lip of brick. Zaitsev licked a crack in his lip where the air had made paper out of skin. He thought about a sheep in the Urals that had once watched him from 30 meters, as if nothing interesting could ever come from a human hand. And then the sun did the one thing it could do. It moved. The hole glowed for a breath, barely. Something in that dark space made the light hesitate. A pane? A lens? Or the barest edge of a metal ring? NHE didn't fire into the center of the hole. He aimed at the thin arc where he knew the lens hood would be, 1 finger's width of black around a circle of glass. He exhaled until the rifle felt lighter, then asked the trigger a question. The rifle answered. Nothing moved. No sound. No hand scrambling. No cry. Zaitsev kept his eye on the sight and let silence do the math. 1 minute. 2. 3. He didn't believe time until it hurt. Only then did he crawl forward, as if the earth might change its mind. NHE reached the rubble and found what the snow had kept to itself. A shattered optic like a blind eye, a rifle on its side, and the quiet shape of a man curled around his last thought. He didn't celebrate. He looked for a tag, found one, and read the letters as if they were part of a prayer someone else had written. He would remember the name the way he remembered the angle of a hillside where wolves used to cross. He covered the body with snow and brick, the only ceremony the city still allowed. And after that day, everything grew louder. The Germans sent fewer men into the open. The Russians moved with a confidence they'd earned in the currency of breath. Zaitsev could still walk where he wanted, but now, everywhere he went, a story followed. He hated stories in places where men were trying not to become them. Command found him a scope, and the Mosin learned a new language. The new lens didn't make him cocky. It made him careful in a different way. He began to teach. He taught what people always forget to teach, how to watch men forget they're visible. He showed where to look for small bad habits, how cigarettes write names in the air, how knees betray impatience, how the muzzle of a rifle that has just been moved breathes a little steam. NHE drilled them on distance, the way a shepherd drills his dog on direction. Do not fire the first time you can. Wait for the second. Do not shoot at rank if you can shoot at function. If you can't tell which man gives the orders, shoot the one the others look at when they're scared. NHI students learned quickly because the city punished slow readers. NTHE snipers became the only predictable thing in a place that hated patterns. The rhythm of one bullet every hour, the way German uniforms flinched in the same language across an entire front, the slight drop in mortar fire whenever a silhouette slumped the wrong way. And inside that rhythm, Zaitsev found a strange mercy. Killing at long distance felt less like killing and more like refusing a future that had chosen the wrong parents. He did not relish it. He respected it the way masons respect gravity. Without it, the work would be dishonest. NTHE battleground on. The Volga froze harder. Men disappeared into cold that didn't bother to keep their names. Food became a rumor told by crumbs. Sometimes, improvised field stoves made soup from things that shouldn't be soup. And men ate anyway, because a body is a machine with demands, even when the mind is busy being older than it should be. Then, one morning, a mortar round stitched light into darkness near Zaitsev's position. The shock stole the horizon. The world turned white and then narrowed. He blinked and found the world still asking him to see it. A sliver of metal had kissed his face in a way metal should not kiss anything. For a short time, his world went soft around the edges. He learned to aim with memory and hands trained to obey even when the eyes argued. He refused evacuation with the quiet arrogance of a man who wanted to keep his promises in the same room where he made them. When his vision returned to itself, or close enough, he went back to the chimney, the rubble, the maps the city wrote with fire. He went back because leaving would have felt like taking full lungs out of a room where someone else was still holding their breath. NBY then, the Red Army had learned how to fight Stalingrad as if it had been born in it. They lured, they pinned, they cut supply lines like thread, and they moved in the night like men who believed the ground could be persuaded. The encirclement came down like a lid. The German Sixth Army looked up from its own instructions and found the instructions had run out of future. NTHE end, when it came, did not feel like an ending. It felt like exhaustion finally writing its own permission slip. Surrender is never graceful. It is a room too full, with a door that won't open until every single breath has said yes. Zaitsev watched the surrender the way a carpenter watches a roof fail, with the professional recognition that all things collapse in the direction of their lazy habits. And after the last shot in that corner of the city, after the last German had laid down a rifle that could no longer carry pride, Zaitsev did something ordinary. He cleaned his weapon. He wiped the stock with a cloth that had once been a shirt. He bent his neck left, then right, paused when the muscles told him their small truths, and smiled in the half-embarrassed way men smile when they realize they have survived something that had no interest in letting anyone survive. Stories grew around him like frost grows around the last warm thing in a field. He did not push them away, because pushing frost is foolish. He let them be. Command used his face as a lantern in dark places. New recruits looked at him the way young shepherd dogs look at the old one, who knows where the ravine begins. He accepted medals because refusing them would have been a kind of pride he couldn't afford. And at night, he still heard the sound snow makes when it forgives a body for falling into it. He still saw the circle of a lens, black rim around bright. He still smelled brick dust, a smell that clings to memory the way smoke clings to old coats. Some say the German he killed had been the best German he could find, a man of practice and calculation, a teacher with a reputation that could split rooms into silence. Others say the name was propaganda, a story gifted to the living to help them stay alive. Zaitsev did not argue. He had learned that truth and usefulness often share a coat. He left the arguing to men who had the luxury of full stomachs and warm chairs. NHE kept teaching. It was the one thing winter could not break. He taught men to measure days not by hours, but by opportunities they didn't take. He taught how to borrow patience from the cold. He taught them to love the part of the job that involved not moving at all. War taught him something back, that every miracle looks like discipline to the person performing it. People called him a legend. He called himself a worker who had good tools and better luck. When he wrote to a friend from the front, short letters, clumsy with numb fingers, he did not mention numbers. He mentioned weather. He mentioned how the river sounded in a thaw, the creek under thin ice, the way silence changes pitch right before artillery finds your street. He mentioned a dog that followed a column one afternoon and refused to be shooed, and how men gave the animal a name because naming things that want to live is an act of defiance. NHE did not write about fear. He didn't have to. Fear was the grammar of the city. Everyone spoke it, and everyone understood it without needing to say a word. In BY Spring, when the Volga remembered it was supposed to move, Zaitsev packed his rifle the way a man packs a photograph, carefully, with fingers that know edges. He stood on ground that would never be level again and listened to a kind of quiet that didn't require his permission. When the question came years later, did the duel really happen? Did that German really exist? He smiled a little. There was a man, he said. He was good. He made one mistake. I waited for it. NTHAT was all. No embroidery, no sermon. Just a sentence as spare as a winter tree. And maybe that is what the city remembered most, that in a place built to measure strength in tanks and tons, a single breath held a little longer than fear expected could tilt a day. That patience, applied at the right angle, is heavier than steel. In the end, the city swallowed its dead, kept its ruins, and learned how to say its name again without flinching. The Volga ran with spring, indifferent and absolute. Life, stubborn, impolite, found ways to be life. And men who had learned to be ghosts learned, slowly, how to be people again. NBUT. There is a corner in every winter where stillness is still a weapon. There is a second, every day, where the world asks you to choose between movement and sense. Zaitsev lived there for months and walked back out with a lesson he never wrote down because it didn't need paper. NHE who waits wins. NNTHE, winter did not end because someone declared it finished. It ended the way hard things end. Slowly, then all at once. Ice loosened its arguments. The Volga remembered it had somewhere to be. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, where rooms still wore the outline of furniture long gone, Vasily Zaitsev did what all serious craftsmen do after a victory. He cleaned his tools and taught his trade. NHE began with 5 men, then 10, then 20, then more. They were farm boys, with hands that knew rope and grain, factory men whose palms remembered heat and weight, students with ink on their cuffs, a miner who could smell damp stone from 100 paces, a hunter who had never imagined a rabbit would be practice for anything but supper. Zaitsev gathered them in a half-basement that used to be a laundry. The ceiling was low. The wind found every gap. The floor smelled faintly of ash and soap. He spoke quietly, as if volume could crack what was left of the walls. NHE did not start with rifles. He started with eyes. "Look," he said, and pointed not at the horizon, but at a corner where frost had etched ferns on brick. "See the pattern? It tells you which way the air moves. Air moves stories. Stories move men. Men move mistakes." NHE showed them how to read a city as if it were a forest that had forgotten its trees. A doorway without footprints was a sentence that needed a verb. A window with soot at the upper left corner spelled stove and breath. A line of snow on a ledge told you how long a silhouette had been dumb enough to stand there. A broken bottle glittered where no glass should, and that glitter meant someone had been there at night with a careless boot. NHE taught them to build nests and call them something else, positions that weren't obvious from across a street, beds of brick dust and burlap, whose job was to hold stillness without opinion. They learned to lay their rifles on cloth, not metal, so vibrations died without telling the enemy what kind of heartbeat lived in the scope. A man asked about shooting. Zaitsev shook his head like a father, teasing a child who wants dessert at noon. "We will shoot," he said, "after we know why." He taught them range with buttons pinned along a wall, each button ahead at a different distance, each distance a number you learned until your fingers knew it before your tongue. He drilled holdover and wind the way a blacksmith drills rhythm, slow, exact, then faster, then exact, again. NHE let them fire only when they stopped wanting to. They learned the discipline of water, one sip, swallowed without a throat jump. The ribs learned to stay slack. The lungs learned the half-breath release, the small miracle that turned a shake into a line. They learned to wait through itch and cramp, to let ants investigate cuffs, to be kind to flies, because swatting is a speech you don't want to make. NHE taught them what to aim at when the shot can be a sentence with more than one subject. Rank? Sometimes. Radios? Often. The man who points with his whole arm? Always. The one whose head bends toward maps like a prayer? If you have only one bullet before the street answers back, that's where the bullet goes. And they learned tricks, because war respects mischief. Zaitsev's favorite, the double helmet on a stick. One helmet, high and obvious, to collect a German boast. The second, lower and off-center, to collect the man who came to celebrate. Another, the mirror sliver at knee height, angled to show boots under a fence, not faces above it. Another, broken glass arranged in a shallow arc, so a careless step would sing a chord only a trained ear could hear. A brigade facing men like that doesn't feel hunted, it feels humiliated. Columns that once marched with straight shoulders and songs now ducked under the judgment of invisible eyes. Runners learned to love walls. Officers found the center of their bodies with a new modesty. Field kitchens, those noisy, fragrant declarations that a unit intends to live through dinner, moved back behind safer ruins. The brigade's pulse changed. You could see it in the way men smoked, shorter, cupped, quick, or not at all. Word came down the German chain to deal with the problem. They brought in their own snipers, good ones, patient ones, men who knew the same grammar. They laid traps and set mirrors and placed decoys. They fired on the second movement, just as doctrine says. They waited for a head, got a sleeve, waited for a sleeve, got a hat, waited for a hat, got silence. The brigade discovered what it meant to meet a mind that had already read your chessbook and scribbled in the margins. Zaitsev did not outshoot them so much as outthink them. He moved his teams like water, two here, one there, a third waiting to punish whatever mistake the first two invited. He let the Germans get used to a rhythm, then retired the rhythm, then brought it back with one note changed. He found where the brigade hid its pride and pressed there, the way a doctor presses for a pulse. NHE used the city as accomplice. He asked a mortar crew for smoke where none was needed, just to make a lane feel safe. Then he placed a rifleman in the lane's second shadow, where no one looks because eyes are lazy. He asked a sapper to hang a sheet, like laundry, across a hole, told him to smear the sheet with soot, waited for someone to use the sheet as cover, and put a bullet where the fold told him a head would pause. They say a sniper is a solo instrument. At Stalingrad, it became a small orchestra, and Zaitsev learned to conduct. The brigade began to hear the music before the first note, which is how you know a plan is working. NTHE dual story traveled with him. The German instructor, the contest of patience, the lens cracked by a bullet aimed at a black rim. Some of it may be true, some polished by tongues that needed steel to sound like a fable. Zaitsev did not correct anyone. He let the myth do work. If a legend makes a man keep his head down, that legend pays rent. If it makes a recruit lift his eyes at the right second, it earns its bowl of soup. Yet the ledger of the winter holds another entry, the wound. On a day that had pretended to be like any other day, the enemy's mortar found an idea of where Zaitsev lay and sent its punctuation. The blast pushed light through his skull. When his eyes returned, they did not return as he left them. The world was a soft-edged coin, spinning. He was carried out, protesting in a whisper, because voices burn oxygen faster than patience, and he needed both. In a field hospital that smelled like carbolic and old bread, a surgeon with steadier hands than gods used glass and gauze, and a million tiny prayers to pull the slivers out. Zaitsev learned new waiting, the kind done in a bed with bandages that asked to be ignored. He learned how to hold still when there is nothing to aim at but tomorrow. NHE did not say he was afraid. He was afraid that the rifle would never feel like a handshake again. Afraid that the world would refuse to sharpen. Afraid that the pupils in his students' eyes, those dark mirrors, would now reflect a man who could only talk and not do. NHI's vision came back in slices. The edges first, a corner of a wall made real, the exact place where a beam's shadow stopped, the little chip in a cup that proved cups can outlive buildings. A week later, he was reading numbers at 20 paces by touch memory. A week after that, he saw a fly land on a window frame and knew, by the fact of the landing, that the building was still. NHE returned to his nest not because he needed to shoot, but because he needed to feel like himself in the one place that had made sense. He went prone, and the earth under his ribs said welcome in the language of pressure. He looked through the glass and found, mercifully, the horizon still open for business. NBY then, the brigade opposite had a new mission: survive the winter and the encirclement. The Red Army's ring had tightened, the angles narrowed, trucks died where they stood, horses stood where they died. The city's air turned thick with breath and mistakes. Zaitsev and his school did quieter work now, watching, punishing the last eruptions of arrogance, keeping heads low so sappers could crawl closer and men with grenades could argue forcefully with machine gun nests. When the end came for that brigade, it wore white flags made from bandages and tablecloths. It wore faces that couldn't do arithmetic anymore, because numbers require calories. Men walked out of cellars with hands that had finally learned tired. Zaitsev watched without triumph. He studied those hands. In a different world, they would have built houses. NTHE city exhaled. Not relief. There is no relief in a place that has spent itself. It exhaled acceptance. The Volga cracked and sighed. The Red Army moved, not like victors, but like men who had been allowed to live long enough to work again. Zaitsev wrote a few lines in his notebook that night. Not numbers. A note about wind coming off water when thaw begins. A note about how snow remembers steps for a while after feet have decided the next thing. A note that said, teach them to love not shooting as much as shooting. He underlined love once and put the notebook away. He slept with his rifle within reach, not out of need, but because habits are a kind of home. In the months after Stalingrad, commanders sent him to do what he had already started: build more men like him. He traveled to places with roofs, to rooms with chalkboards, to ranges where paper replaced silhouettes that used to have families. He stood at a blackboard and drew angles and sight pictures and wind roses, and the chalk dust clung to his finger the way brick dust once had. He told stories with the adjectives removed. He made patience sound ordinary, and discipline sound like a friend who never fails to meet you on time. NHE preached boring virtues, the kind that save lives without asking for applause. He told them, be punctual for your breath, be modest with your movements, be greedy with your caution, be proud only of the shots you didn't take. They wrote it down not because it sounded heroic, but because it sounded like the kind of advice that survives winter. NTHE students went out and made their own winters end sooner. Some returned to sit on his table and describe in careful words how a doorway had lied and how they had made the lie confess. He listened with the humility of a man who knows the craft is older than the current war and younger than the next. As the front moved west and the map found its arrows again, the legend of the duel continued to walk without feet. Some said the German officer had been a colonel, not a major. Some said his name was different, that the place was different, that the angle of the sun would not have allowed such a glint on such a day. Others swore they had seen the broken scope with their own eyes, had touched the glass with fingers that could still feel the crack. Zaitsev, when asked, would smile in that slow way of men who have learned to be kind to questions. I don't know about legends, he would say. I know about habits. We took his last one away. NWA's it one man outsmarting a brigade. In the simplest arithmetic, yes. A single mind taught to be still can bend 1,000 into smaller shapes. But if you lift the paper and look beneath, you find other sums. The spotter whose eyes never demanded credit. The sappers who trusted a lane because a ghost had cleaned it. The sergeants who told their squads to smoke with the ember in the fist. The cook who moved the kitchen 10 meters back because he had learned how far a rumor can travel. And a brigade feels outsmarted when all its easy moves go dull at once. Zaitsev's craft made that happen. He changed the friction coefficient of a day. He made arrogance expensive. He charged a toll for careless steps. He wrote, in the city's broken grammar, a rule. If you behave like an army on a parade ground, you will donate men to the winter. And after the war, when medals found drawers and stories found listeners, he returned to ordinary things. He worked, he fished, he stood in lines with everyone else, because victory, blessed, does not abolish lines. He married. He laughed with the kind of laughter that has to climb a hill before it reaches the mouth. He hunted again, not to rehearse death, but to feed living, and even then he favored patience over bullets. He taught his children and his students how to be quiet when quiet is the strongest sentence you can say. Sometimes he visited places that remembered him. Men shook his hand the way men shake a tool that still feels good. He didn't practice speeches. He didn't keep a script in his pocket. If pressed, he told the story the way he had lived it, lean, unadorned, full of respect for the parts that did not need his name. He died, as all men do, on a day that had other things on its schedule. He left behind a few lines in a notebook, a rifle that had learned honesty, and a way to use time as a weapon. The city where he waited lived on. It grew walls from bricks that had once been thoughts. Children shouted in courtyards that had once swallowed sound. People crossed the Volga on bridges that did not remember the ice. Then somewhere, always somewhere, there is a rooftop, a hillside, a ragged window in a building too tired to be a building, and a human being learning the first lesson that winter taught, that stillness, properly aimed, is not absence. It is force, NTHE dual, the brigade, the winter. They make a strong story, but the ending is not a shout, it is a nod. The nod a craftsman gives the work when the work holds. The nod a shepherd gives the dog at dusk. The nod a man gives the rifle he is about to clean. Because the truth of it is this: bravery is not noise. It is a long, unremarkable silence that chooses its one sentence well. NHE, who waits, wins. And sometimes, he who teaches others to wait lets entire armies lose on time. NSO. If you ever find yourself in a room where fear is loud and the future is impatient, remember the city of brick dust and breath. Remember the man who turned minutes into shelter. Remember that patience, at the right distance, is sharper than any blade. NTHAT is how a single mind outsmarted a brigade, by being ordinary in a way that the extraordinary could not survive, by turning the clock into terrain, by refusing to move until movement was a verdict. NTHE River moves on. The city names itself again each spring. And in the places where stories are stored, there is a shelf that holds one slim volume about a winter when a rifle spoke very softly and a lesson spoke forever.